You're welcome to the polling station, the first one of February 2021, an ever evolving, if slowly evolving 2021. And we have loads to discuss today. We'll probably bring in the US at some stage. There's William Kajani waving in the background. He's going to discuss what's going on in France. But primarily, it'll be topics closer to home. We have the British election study results arising from the 2019 election, consequences for Labour out of that, the red wall and so on. And we're also going to discuss Kiera Starmer's first year in power and I guess relevant betting topics to come out of that, and how the Conservatives are looking, with a very, very interesting question from Ben Keith, because we do remember how Boris rather enjoyed something of a surge in popularity when he contracted the coronavirus, which to me just shows how stupid people are. Anyway, we will talk about this in due course and many other things with William Kajani, who's utterly resplendent. You look like a football jersey that has like a kind of like a stripe going down the middle of it from the sun today. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's absolutely glorious. It's even nice to look at that it does look there as well. So that has brightened my mood in amongst all of the heady political discourse, which we're going to be discussing this afternoon.
Yeah, so the British election study, this is a few days old at this stage. It happened since we were on last week. Lots of stuff about ethnicity breakdown and just in general about why Labour lost votes to the Conservatives. And there's a theory out there that some of these votes that were lost to the so-called the red wall will not be retrievable. What do we know?
So what we know is firstly that some trends did make a big change and some trends stayed the same. One thing actually that I am finding interesting is that there is a big increase in the non-white Tory votes. The Tory votes has actually jumped in terms of non-white Britons, which I think is interesting and I think does go some way possibly maybe to explaining the size of that victory. I think, it's definitely
24% to 17% compared to the previous election of that was the estimate. Then that's a massive jump in the non-white, and I hate using these terms, but the non-white vote.
Yeah, I just think these things are interesting because they can give you lots more context, and I think it's particularly important this one because first of all, the methodology here is a bit different. They usually do it face to face. Obviously, that's not as feasible right now, but I think it's interesting to track these sort of demographics long term. An example of one thing you could have seen, the growing sort of influx of Latino voters to different areas of the United States has been a predictor for the margin of some election results there. Also, it's interesting if you break down that data. And again, I'm using a bit of a tortured metaphor, but you had an advantage if you knew who was where and when those votes would be counted in the US election. We saw that with the markets. So I think it's interesting to note some of the BES conclusions as well. What it suggests to me is that whilst Labour are the party most popular with non-white people in this country, the margin isn't quite as big as some people think, and I don't think it's worth. I really don't think it's wise to totally write off the Tories when it comes to that demographic, even though there's still a pretty big gap. But I did think that was interesting to note. Other things which are interesting in the BES, and it's something, by the way, that I just encourage people to look at if predicting elections and trying to think about politics is your thing. Firstly, the relationship in terms of the age of turnout is still fairly stable. I think, if anything, actually, that probably might have been quite a good predictor of the Labour drop from 2017 to 2019. Generally speaking, the more things have changed, the more they've stayed the same. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote in that election. Interesting also to note the increase in the Conservative vote mainly came from older people, but the changes with Labour's vote were more dramatic, actually, amongst younger voters, which is interesting. And also worth noting on the Lib Dems, their stagnation was across all age groups. Interestingly, I say this because the Lib Dems actually went quite short to win a lot of seats. They did not have the results that they'd hoped for.
I guess the key thing to point out, this was a very unique election with regard to Brexit and the very simple slogan of getting Brexit done, which obviously coloured the election results to a large degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next time that comes round, there is not going to be, I don't think, quite a unifying factor. I am of the opinion that the after effects of Brexit may still have some effect on what happens in the future with British politics. I think you'd be naive not to say so, particularly actually when it comes to stuff like Northern Ireland and Scotland. But whether that vote is going to be so unified for one campaign remains to be seen. That vote is still holding solid, by the way. The Tories are still on 40. It's Labour that have crept much closer, which I think we'll discuss in a moment.
Yeah, well, that brings us on to Kiera Starmer. He obviously was, coming into power in Labour on the back of the failure of Jeremy Corbyn, really, to carry his message in relation to both Brexit and just the future of Britain, I guess, in the 2019 election. Kiera Starmer, much steadier hands and not so much of a red wall here. How would you assess his first year?
His first job, I mean, much of it depends on what you think his job is, right? Like, is his job to make Labour electable again? And what does electable mean?
And again, we have to point out that the coronavirus is on in the background, and anyone in opposition has a completely different role to play right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a tricky point for Starmer because Labour has given the government plenty of support on things such as, I mean, these are all generic things, right? You would expect a political party to be in favour of vaccinations and stuff, and in favour of getting kids to school as early as possible. Sometimes I believe he might have been a bit hasty to offer that support, and that's coming back to bite him possibly a little bit now. But he's had a difficult enough task in the sense that he had a mountain to climb polling wise. Now, Labour are within touching distance of the Tories in the polls. You have different results that will say at one point Labour are leading, at one point the Conservatives are leading. In reality, they're within sort of touching distance. The issue for Starmer is defining himself as being something different from not Jeremy Corbyn, who can wear a suit and stand in front of a flag. That's going to be really tricky for him, I think, or it's proving to be worryingly tricky. Again, this probably depends on when the next election is. We're 5-2 on that it takes place in 2024. That's 71% chance you have an election for 3 years or so. There's a lot of water to pass under the bridge. But Labour have gotten themselves to the crossroads where they need to kick on and define their strategy. I think, and this is a widely held view, becoming more widely held all the time, Starmer has to start defining himself and start standing for things. And I don't necessarily think in the most respectful way, for Queen and Country ground is the most fertile ground for him. I can see him struggling a bit to say, I'm as patriotic as Boris Johnson. I don't know that the ground is fertile in terms of traditional voting values, the traditional way that people look at the Labour Party, the media, etc. I just don't know that the ground's there for him to do that. And there was a report, by the way, I'm referencing in The Guardian, which suggests that Labour have been told that they need to embrace patriotism and the flag and to dress smartly and to back veterans, etc., to win the next election. And I think that's really blasé and sort of quite
like whimsical.
Yeah, it's very whimsical. I do agree with that. I don't necessarily think Labour's problem is actually sort of even patriotism or whatever. I think it's more the fact that people have an idea of the Labour Party as a party that isn't as patriotic as the Conservatives. But what we have to remember is that the Conservatives have really gone all out to occupy that ground. And they also have a media, I think, that very much emphasises that point for them, at least in print terms. I don't know that Labour can get their tanks on that lawn very easily. And I don't know that it would be a worthwhile endeavour for him. Just quickly also to speak about the Red Wall. We talk a lot about Labour making a comeback here or there. The polling suggests they are actually doing that. there was polling from JLL Partners. I've talked about it for Star before, which suggests that they've made pretty big gains since 2019 in the Red Wall. I just think in terms of Starmer going that bit further, he's got to actually define himself as something different than, essentially a middle manager, a competent middle manager, which, maybe some people have been desperate for post-Corbyn. I'm not going to really pass a big judgment on Corbyn or whatever. Starmer's job at some point will be to say, what would I do? What would a Keir Starmer Britain look like? And at the moment, I don't think we've seen very much of that.
It's 8-11 the Conservatives and 11-10 Labour for most seats in the next election, and 9-4 each of two in terms of Labour majority. I'm going to bring in Ben Keith's question here, actually. Considering you're talking about patriotism, which always kind of worries me if that's actually going to be relevant in terms of Labour doing this or the Tories doing that. But Ben's question is very interesting because it brings up ever patriotic Boris. And I say that kind of with a little bit of a pinch of salt. If Boris does win the vaccine race, will his polls hit record highs? Now, it's interesting to ask you that from an Irish perspective, where we obviously had all that furore about the EU's intervention in terms of the vaccines potentially crossing into Great Britain from Northern Ireland and so forth last week. But there's a serious situation in Ireland where people have gotten fed up with the government's kind of inability to really know what they're doing with this. And the funereal pace, it would seem, over here of vaccine rollouts compared to what's going on in Britain. And I guess there is an element of envy there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just also in Ireland, it's in pretty much every EU country. We're seeing a lot of discontent. We're seeing a lot of envy for the way Britain has gone about it. I just think it's also worth saying the whole EU approach to vaccines has been an absolute mess from the start. And I say that simply as a matter of fact. I think, buying as a global conglomerate or whatever was a sort of understandable move. By the way, I should say, countries could diverge from it. Hungary diverged from it and went their own way with it. It was possible.
Could we use Hungary as any sort of a bastion of anything?
Probably not probably not the wisest decision I've ever made on this.
Sometimes these autocracies work better in times of crisis and so forth. It is a fact.
Indeed, and that has been one of the sort of bigger debating topics of COVID. But just going back to the whole EU rollout thing, I think mistake one was possibly maybe having eggs in too few baskets. Mistake two, and this is, I think, where it's really come home to roost for them, was essentially the sort of fury at the supply pace to rollout. When actually it was a simple question of business and economics, right? You make your contract 3 months earlier, you pay for it 3 months earlier, you get your thing 3 months earlier. It's a really tortured metaphor I'm using, but the EU seems to be, the old git or the old grumpy person across the road who just can't believe that they haven't got their Amazon Prime package at the same time as their neighbour, despite the fact that their neighbour ordered it a week ago.
This is the beauty of William Kajani. He cannot take the motorway. He has to go down the winding road, such as his love of politics and life. The question from Ben Keith was, if Boris does win the vaccine race, Ben is in the background waiting for the answer. Will his polls hit record highs? And I think they actually might.
I think we've already seen Johnson's record high in polling. We always talk about the Tories and being at 40%. I sort of wonder if that might be their ceiling as well.
Right.
If basically both parties have a ceiling of 40, unless something changes. So to answer Ben's question, they are pushing the approval ratings of Johnson up. They are pushing the approval ratings of the government up. They are pushing the polls up. But that maximum is probably about 40. We're rolling out the jab at 2 million doses a week. It's 40%. Maybe perhaps as we go into spring and summer, there might be an optimism bounce or whatever. People think that'll be the case for the local elections. But at the moment, 40% is the ceiling. So yeah, people are giving the government and Boris Johnson credit. How long it lasts for, I don't know. Wouldn't be certain it will push him to, like, say 45, whatever, in the polls.
Of course, Ben Keith's popularity has gone through the roof, not only with his offer of unbelievable food for the Super Bowl for customers and so forth, but also this industry offer for people within the industry who actually want to have a bet. But Nicola Sturgeon,
inundated offers.
Yes, inundated. it's something I'd love to actually chat about another week on some format here. But Nicola Sturgeon's popularity at the moment, and how worried would you be for her in terms of just this little tricky pickle that the S&P has gotten itself into?
I would be quite concerned on a number of fronts. Firstly, the S&P, generally speaking, hasn't had the negative public coverage of its internal affairs that, say, the Labour Party has, even to some point, actually, Conservatives. There haven't generally been these massive splits in the S&P, or if there have, and I'm happy to be corrected on that, they haven't had the public coverage that the Joanna Cherry affair over transphobia has had recently, or indeed that Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond affair has had recently. Now, I'm not going to be here making sort of any big accusations, but this is a very tricky period for the S&P and very dangerous for Sturgeon, particularly as there's a high amount of legal jeopardy with regards to Salmon's evidence. And with regard to Joanna Cherry, she is a very well-known figure, and again, no disrespect necessarily to anybody involved here, but she's a very loud public figure who is not going to go away quietly over this. That sort of thing can really damage a political party. And we've seen it before. I think it did have an effect with Labour. So I think it's worth keeping a close eye on. I'd expect the S&P to win the elections and win them handsomely no matter what. The defining issue, much like with the Tories and Brexit, is probably in Scottish independence. But it's interesting that Will Barber-Taylor asked this question. I'd say the state of the S&P is probably as unhealthy as it has been for some time. Again, I'm observing from England. I follow plenty of Scottish experts. There has been plenty of discord in that party for some time. Will it even matter for the Scottish elections? I don't really know. Scottish Labour are looking for a new leader. Boris Johnson went and made a visit to Scotland, and it didn't really go over well. And as long as Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, he will always be that really crucial attack figure for the S&P. One quick thing to note here. I think that it's quite interesting that somebody said recently, and I really wish I could find out who it was, but a key part of IndyRef 2, if when it happens, is that when it does, Boris Johnson most likely won't be Prime Minister. I think that's really worth thinking about. Really worth thinking about. Anyway, moving on.
What's going on in France?
So some really interesting polling recently for the 2022 presidential election, namely the fact that Marine Le Pen was beating Emmanuel Macron in a head-to-head in polls recently, 52 to 48. Where have we seen those numbers before, I ask? Macron, generally speaking, is going through the sort of process that every French president goes for, is that they tend to become more unpopular over time and maintain that. If you look at it overall, Macron is just behind Le Pen currently in terms of the polls, with Bertrand at 15% and Mélenchon at 10%. There are plenty people away at 7%, including, I believe, Anne Hidalgo, Mayor of Paris. Macron's got a lot on his plate right now. A absolutely abysmally slow French vaccine rollout. I believe actually even much slower than Ireland's. Is going to be a problem. France is still under a heavy lockdown in terms of restrictions. They appear to have a much better outcome for COVID overall than the UK, but recovery is going to be key this year, and he'll want that to take place sooner rather than later. If he can do that within the next few months, I'm sure that will give him a little kick in the polls. But again, there are a lot of heated culture wars in France. And when you see Macron himself pushing out anti-vaccine disinformation, and there's no word to say about what he said, that is just anti-vaccine disinformation, you can tell he's rattled. And I wonder how much more rattled he's going to get for the rest of the year.
Probably lastly on politics, the US now. We've had an interesting start to the year. Ended up actually meeting a couple of friends for a walk yesterday, and much of the talk was about the US election and so forth. What is the latest on the Joe Biden presidency?
Lots of executive actions, people mostly pleased with them. Steady start in his approval ratings with 538. He has obviously a better approval than disapproval, reversing the sort of permanent running lines with the Trump approval disapproval ratings. He's only been in there for a short while, but he appears to have hit the ground running. His main issue, as with pretty much every other world leader, vaccines, the pace of vaccines. The US has supply issues, it has logistical issues for each state, it has technological issues. Many states are using recording systems that don't actually work properly, leading to appointments being missed or having to take by hand. They're still vaccinating the eldest earliest, which means that signing up is difficult, tracking the data is really difficult. All these things are combining together to make for a bad time for Joe Biden. Well, not bad time just for Joe Biden, but a bad time as far as the US vaccine rollout is going. So that's a challenge that he's got to tackle. But I think the main thing to remember is that he's probably got a bit of a honeymoon period, probably a little bit. And I think many people will just be happy not to have Trump there. So that will give him a bit of political cover, although I do think he will need to sort that problem out soon, especially given that the case rate and the death rate remain very, very high. And there is not this sort of universal control that he has over the country, as say Johnson does, as say Macron does, as say even Merkel does, or any autocratic leader. There are different states in the US doing things very differently. So vaccination even more important over there than it is, I'd say, anywhere else, to be honest, especially when it comes to having an effect on things like the R rate. Just one thing to mention, Jeff Bezos, CEO.
The big man has stepped down from Amazon. I wish I'd stepped down from Amazon.
Oh, what a life it'd be, what a dream it would be, Johnny. We go 100 to 1 for 2024. Couple of reasons for that. Number one, he isn't running as a Republican. I think it'd be more likely he'd run as a Democrat. If you're running as a Democrat, you're doing very well to kick either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris out of that nomination position. I don't think we've ever heard really of a sitting president not being allowed to run again unless they've resigned or left for some other reason. He could run as an independent. I don't doubt that he will be able to fund the campaign, but we've seen the super rich person run. Ross Perot, probably the best example of it. Now, he had a big part to play in that election for sure, but he didn't win. He didn't come close. I think he got 31 electoral votes. Michael Bloomberg tried to do the big money run as a Democrat thing. Hopeless. Where did he come? And that's about as rich as sort of Bezos is, and he had Bloomberg as well. I don't see Bezos doing it, to be honest with you, but 100 to 1 would seem about right for his chances. I mean, if you decide to really target it, no doubt he could have a significant impact, no doubt. But I think at the moment he's going to stick to the Washington Post and watching the Amazon juggernaut roll on.
Thanks to the guys for sending in questions, including Will Barber Taylor, who said, presume the state of the S&P in relation to the May elections is going to be talked about. Look forward to listening to the episode regardless. Thanks, Will. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And Ben Keats' question we mentioned, Justin McGurk, what chance of local elections going ahead in May? As planned. If not, why not? I get the socially distant stuff, but if they could keep voting booths open for 2 to 3 days, question mark.
Pretty high chance. I believe the Electoral Commission has already said to go ahead with it. Voting booths being open for 2-3 days is actually very much possible. I think some other countries have done that. I believe there are measures being taken regarding COVID. I think we could see an increase in postal votes for sure, but not all postal voting. So I'd say the local election would definitely go ahead this year, probably most likely in May.
Now, this tweet from @Drill, this man, of course, has 1.6 million followers, turning a big dial that says racism on it and constantly looking back at the audience for approval, like a contestant on The Price is Right. It's got 30.7 thousand likes, and the extent to which Labour's strategies right now carry the ethos of the Drill tweet and how them being or not being that helps or hurts Labour. And that's from Richard B., who is a fan of the show, I believe.
He is. We love that question from Richard B. Okay, so Labour are very clearly going to put some eggs, if not a lot of them, in the, let's say, the flag basket, to be respectful. Now, to lead a country, it is true that you want people to believe that you like it, that you've got its best interests at heart. The initial ratings for Keir Starmer on this are okay. I believe they're better than Jeremy Corbyn. He gets much less of a hard time than Corbyn did regarding supposed pro or anti-Britishness. And I think we'll begin to see that come through when it does get close to an election. However, and this is the point I was making earlier, patriotic discourse at the moment is something that it's dominated by the Conservatives, primarily because of the systems that we have in this country. You have newspapers which are, I would have said, bar the Guardian and the Mirror, almost reliably Tory. They are going to push forward the Tory narrative on that. It's an easy place for Tories to beat their chest about the flag, beat their chest about loving Britain, etc. And there's a media monopoly there, and also sort of pipeline that does lead to that going online and also onto print, not just print TV, but national TV as well. I think it's very hard for Labour to go and muscle in on that territory. And I think that this sort of misplaced idea, it's me saying it's misplaced, basically to become extremely and very patriotic, might mean that they miss the more obvious things that they need to do well on, which is namely the economy. They need to be seen as economically viable, and they need to be seen as ready for power. Those percentages have improved with Starmer there, but they have begun to plateau. And as I said previously, not being Jeremy Corbyn and being a guy who can wear a suit and be forensic is not going to be enough to win an election. Starmer has to do things other than that.
This might be a stupid question, but presumably the maintenance of the union has to be a massive priority for him, because he may have a better chance of Boris with that in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. However, that is another issue for him, because you can't break up the pro-Indie bloc in Scotland. You can deny them a referendum. You can fight for the union as hard as you want, but that pro-Indie bloc and that pro-Remain Indie bloc too can't be broken up at the moment. Very difficult for Labour to suddenly start making ground and winning back seats in Scotland unless they have a really compelling vision for the future that doesn't involve a referendum or whatever. And it's so difficult to argue that there has been anything other than the most substantial, in fact, the most incredible of changes in Scotland's essentially constitutional contract, if I can call it that, with the UK. Things are totally different now. Totally different compared to the first referendum. So he'll make defending the union a priority, but will that hurt his chances in Scotland? I think so. And unfortunately, that's sort of the most non-fertile Tory ground, really, because much of the Tory vote in certain seats is baked in. There's only a certain amount of seats, I believe, really, that you could consider up for grabs, and that's before the boundary review comes into play.
Well, William, we got through so much on the show today. Some worrying references to patriotism, both at home and in relation to Marie Le Pen, which I think we should always be somewhat on guard about. William, thanks so much. We'll be back next week.
And I look forward to it. Thank you very much for all your questions, and thanks for watching.
Yeah, perhaps we'll get to talk a bit more about Northern Ireland next week, where there were some really, really wild things happening this week alongside the Irish Sea border, which may or may not exist. See you next week.
See you next week.